All right, welcome. This is Politics and Parenting, where we talk about politics from the parent's point of view. Today, I'm joined by Eddie Garcia, a U.S. Senate candidate for the people of Virginia, a six-time combat veteran with 2 Bronze Stars, a businessman, and a community leader. Eddie, thank you for joining the show today. How are you doing?
Jeff, I'm doing great, feeling strong. It's a pleasure to be back here with you.
So it's been a little time. How is the campaign going? I know how stressful they can be on just an individual and then a family. Like how's everything like home life going? I know it could be tough on the wife to be away and then the kids to be away. Like you feeling the effects and how are you coping with it?
Well, the campaign is strong, yeah, and running a statewide campaign in Virginia. Virginia is bigger than people give it credit for. And so I've spent just last week, I was on a 7-day road trip. I spent 2 days down in central VA. I spent 2 days down in South Side and dancing around between, Dinwiddie County and Brunswick and some of the places down there, talking to a lot of farmers and ranchers about real issues that concern them. I finished up with another 2.5 days down in the Southwest, down in Christiansburg, Pulaski, Radford, Floyd, and some of those areas down there, Grayson County, really good people. People getting forgotten about, and that's what this campaign is all about. It's about reaching people that have been forgotten about for far too long. They're sick and tired of their government that works for everybody else except them. And so it's super busy, but we got a ton of volunteers right now that are stretched across all 11 congressional districts. And so we're out there putting signs in the ground. We're rallying people. We're at as many events as possible. That includes the wife and kids, because you asked about them. And so they're part of this campaign. Everybody's got both feet in the pool, and we're swimming now. I mean, we're moving in the right direction. They're excited. We're down to the 20-yard line. I know I'm switching analogies on you, but we're on the 20-yard line. We're 40 days out from the primary election date. So it's getting down to the nitty gritty. It's time to buckle your chin straps in and go forward.
So, the kids are helping out. The wife is helping out. That's fantastic. What are you doing to like keep connected? I know your 7-day road trip, you're away from the family, you're grinding, talking to people, shaking hands, like I know how exhausting that, like people don't understand how physically exhausting it is to just talk all day long and to listen, right? I mean, that's part of your job. And like, you get done at the end of the day, I bet you it's probably exhausting to like maybe make that phone call, maybe to make that FaceTime with your kids to like be present in their lives, even though you're away. Is there any like tricks that you're doing? Things that you're using to help you stay grounded, stay connected to your family?
Well, the good part about this for me is that it's always important for people to actually, for politicians or people who want to be politicians, candidates to actually like people. And so I do like people, and it can be taxing. There's a lot of issues out there that a lot of people care about, and you got to listen to them. You got to not always have the solution because things you just don't know about. And Virginia is pretty diverse. I mean, whether you're in Nova or the Valley or the Southwest, South Side, Hampton Roads, or Richmond proper, the RVA area, everybody's got their little nuances. A different culture for each one of those, different issues that affect them. You don't hear too much about solar farms in Northern Virginia, but you hear a lot about them when you're south of Richmond and you're out in the Southwest. You don't hear much about power shortages and whatnot here in Northern Virginia. But when you get to the Southwest, there's a lot of people paying some high electric bills that nobody's tracking. If you don't know what's going on in these areas, how can you represent them truly? How can you how can you build a rapport? So you got to be present. You got to listen to them. You got to hear their concerns, and then ask them questions about how do we think? How do they think that we should be able to solve this at the federal level or even at the state or community level? Just working in leadership in general. I think that's an important piece too. Not only is it a federal issue or a state issue, but we got to have people in all those levels of government that are working together on behalf of the people. And the tricks of the trade are just paying attention and getting people involved, getting a stake in ownership. I think that's the great thing about my campaign that separates from probably previous campaigns is that because I don't have such a hierarchical system, I don't come from this with a political background. We're kind of in startup mode, and we're trying things. and things that work, we push forward on. Things that don't work, we drop real quick. And if you're you're going to be a part of the Garcia campaign. We have the freedom to engage your community, to spread this message of a better tomorrow in ways that maybe I don't know, or other people haven't done in the past. And so giving them an ownership to include my family. My daughters are 12, about to be 12 next week, and 16, and they in their respective schools. They're out there telling their teachers, they're telling their friends' parents that their daddy's running for the U.S. Senate, and you should vote for him because early voting has started. And so everybody's involved. My wife is attending women's clubs and stuff that are going on in our area while I'm down in the Southwest. So it is a full throated effort from everybody involved. And yeah, it means early days, it means late nights, and a lot of talking in between. But that's what's necessary in order to accomplish the mission. And so that's what we're out here doing.
Yeah, so that's great. I love to hear that your family being involved. And man, 12 and 16, you're just like in that really tough parenting age too, having to take on this very difficult task. It's wonderful to hear that, they're participating. It shows like if you can get your children on board with something that's so grand and kind of complex that maybe they don't understand, then that means you can connect with the right group of people. Hopefully it's working for you on the campaign. So let's let's get into like the nitty gritty of what's going on in the world. We've got a lot of issues people are concerned about. I think from a parent's point of view, I think one of the big things that I hear from people and I'm concerned about as a parent is the technology issue. And we hear a lot about this TikTok. Now in 2020, then is it 2020? Yeah. Then President Donald Trump issued an order to ban TikTok if it wasn't sold within 45 days. Now, this order didn't go through. And just recently, Donald Trump put out a video criticizing, in his words, crooked Joe Biden for banning the app. And now Trump is supporting the app. Now, Trump also received massive amounts of campaign donations from I believe TikTok or TikTok founders. So maybe that has a factor in it. But I guess at the end of the day, what I want to know and what parents want to know is, should this app be allowed in the United States? And if it's not, why should it not be allowed?
Well, in full disclosure, I'm on TikTok myself. My campaign's on TikTok. I've been on it for quite some time. That's where a lot of the young people I would now classify young, as in folks under 30. I'm 42 right now, so I'm not too far removed from that crowd. That's where people's eyeballs and attention are turned to. So as a campaign, I got to be on there. I'm not in favor of banning TikTok, quite frankly. I don't approve of the Chinese. I think the Chinese are an enemy. Having said that, I firmly believe in freedom and choice of what people do with their time and where they spend their time and their money. Me personally, I'll just talk to you about how I feel just in social media in general. I mean, I
So
truly believe this too.
hold on, Eddie. I don't want to divert too much from the question, because the question is specifically about banning TikTok, which you expressed that you're not for banning TikTok, and you
Mhm.
also expressed that you're for freedom of expression. So I guess first, let's clarify: the banning of TikTok is not to ban TikTok; it's actually to force the sale from essentially the CCP, the Chinese Communist government, to something else, and then it wouldn't be banned. Um, TikTok is basically, from my understanding, refusing to make that sale and wanting to continue essentially a spy operation in the United States. So, back to that freedom of expression. Does the First Amendment and our Bill of Rights apply to non-American citizens and non-American corporations? Are we supposed to give freedom to everyone in the world and allow everyone the same rights and opportunities as Americans? I don't know if that's feasible for one single country to do. So back to the point, like, if China is using the app to spy on American citizens, children, collecting data and influencing our elections, should they be allowed to do that?
Why would I would be against that? The question is, how do you stop that? especially when the user, whoever the user is, has voluntarily go ahead and downloaded the app and using it for themselves. The same, and I agree with your concerns. I am also concerned about big data and individuals, whether foreign or not, that have access to individuals' privacy. That is a problem. But I don't necessarily see TikTok as an app to be any different as far as data collection and the same concerns as Instagram or Facebook or any of the other social media apps that maybe I'm not on and I'm not aware of. And so
So I think
that is a
the
problem, and those users have now said yes, we're accepting that, and they're going forward.
so I think I mean you're right. It's not just a problem with China collecting data, right? American corporations collect data on Americans as well. I think the difference is, you know, should foreign adversaries be allowed to collect this data and use it to influence American citizens? Because, you know, think back to the emoluments clause. What's the purpose of the emoluments clause? Is to make sure that foreign powers don't have influence over the American political system. And if we're going to allow foreign countries the ability to control communication mechanisms in America, then isn't that allowing them a large portion of control? And, you know, to your point, you know, kind of bringing the two things together, the American corporations and then the foreign corporations, you know, I'm concerned about both. I'm more concerned about the foreign corporation, right? But maybe instead of a specific ban, maybe some sort of you know, transparency bill or a privacy bill for American citizens where you can't collect data, because a lot of these things, you know, first, we are forced to use some of these apps, especially when it comes to children in school. Maybe a teacher assigns an assignment and you have to download this app. And then you go through all these processes and there's all these disclosures. But no, come on, let's be real. Nobody reads these things. They just click yes because they have to use the app. And if they don't use the app, then they're kind of left out of either the social situation or the educational situation. So maybe, you know, we can set the TikTok thing aside and we can go after the big problem, which is, should corporations be able to mine data and influence our children?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. Because just kind of in theory, they're equally the same. Now, in a perfect world, none of these organizations would be backed by any adversary, China or otherwise, and American-owned entities would also be strictly American without outside influence from other parts of the world in the same fashion. But that's just not the place that we find ourselves these days. And so, yeah, I believe that individuals should have the right to privacy when they use their device and don't have and it shouldn't be tracked by big corporations, outside entities, foreign adversaries, or our own government. We have laws to stop the government from doing these things, and for a reason. I would venture to say that falls right under the Fourth Amendment of unreasonable searches and seizures. But here at the same time, we have these corporate entities that are able to that don't fall under there that are doing the same thing. And not only that, is that they're selling the information to various parts, to include our own government, who couldn't get the warrant themselves, but now can purchase the data from these corporations. That's all a problem. It's more multifaceted, whether than the bill to ban TikTok is a good thing or a bad thing. The underlying problem is that is what you're talking about. It's consumer rights and rights to privacies.
Yeah, no, you make a good point. And it seems to be a reoccurring pattern in just any type of government, is the way that either wealthy people or corporations or just a uh, consolidated government works around the laws that they have in place to break the laws, right? The loophole. They can't get the warrant for it, but they can buy it from the corporation. So they allow the corporation to collect the data because it's beneficial for the government, right? It's almost like they're working hand in hand against individuals. And that individual liberty and that American freedom that we so often kind of rally around as American citizens, it very much feels like it's not the same as it should be.
Right. All of these things are set up by our government. hundreds of years ago, to have the idea that they would collude together to conspire against the people. I don't know if it was ever thought about or worked in, but that's what sadly is what's happening. Instead of a branch of the executive versus the legislative, those two entities are working together now in order to exude coercion and control over the population of the people. That's a problem. The corporations, in theory, would be adversarial with regulations of the government, but now they've bought entities of the government through donations, through large money packs, through all these other avenues in which they influence legislation, and they're working hand in glove. Not against who? Against us, against the American people. We have to start breaking that up. I actually wrote a paper when I was in college, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, on the need to break up big tech then. And some of these entities like Facebook, who controls Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, not because I say so, or not because necessarily of what we're talking about, but the Supreme Court had issued a ruling determining that social media is now the new community square, free speech area. And if that's the case, then how can any entity commoditize freedom of speech? And if they're commoditizing this free speech, then they have a monopoly on that free speech and that commodity. And if there's 1.6 billion users controlled by one entity, which is Meta in that case, and this was, like I said, about 6 years ago, then we need to break those things up, because they own WhatsApp, they own IG, and they own Facebook. There's an argument, I believe, to be had there. I think these corporations are too large. They have too much control. They have access to too much data, and we don't know any of what they're doing behind the scenes to either work for government in order to influence government policies, both of the executive or the legislative. We know Mark Zuckerberg himself has donated millions and millions of dollars to political contributions and campaigns across the country. Like, where does the line be drawn? I think we've already crossed that line, but we got to have people who are in there that are actually interested in kind of rolling back some of this power that these corporations have exuded over the last decade or so.
Yeah. So you mentioned something that kind of triggered me, or not triggered me, but made me think of something. I wrote 2 articles this week, and both kind of about the Roosevelt administration. And the Roosevelt administration, I think, was the first one to acknowledge this rising corporate power and how it affected American society and how it controlled American society. And there's a great quote from Roosevelt in there where he says, corporate cunning has outgrown or outpaced the laws of nation and state. And he believed that it was his responsibility as the executive to use federal power to curb corporations. Now, I disagree a little bit with Teddy. I think that he should have empowered state legislatures to take on corporations. But hindsight's 2020. It's easy for me to sit here knowing what I know and all the history that's passed to criticize him. I think where he was sitting is he saw a problem and he decided to act. I think a lot of Americans today, especially on the right, the freedom loving Americans, the right to do business and stuff like that, I think they get confused when they believe in unbridled freedom for corporations, because a concentration of power, regardless of inside of our government or inside of corporation, actually consolidates power inside the government as well, because what you see the corporations pay for the government. So now the corporate entity and the federal entity are the same thing, and they're working for themselves and not for the American people. I think what's really important for Americans to understand is we just have to be rational about the way that we look at the world. And any entity, corporate or government, federal or state, when they accumulate too much power, it infringes on the rights of American citizens. And it doesn't really matter what, right, left, or where you are. If you really believe in freedom, then what you really should focus on is a balance of power in the whole total, sphere. So I hope that if you make it to the Senate, maybe some legislation that focuses on that balancing of power, understanding the right of the corporations versus the right of the government versus the right of the American citizens, to make sure that we have freedom. We still want to be able to build businesses. I still want large, profitable American corporations. I just don't want them s- writing legislation to keep other Americans from competing in the market. And I think that's what we see a lot of times.
Well, I'll just expand this a tad because you made me think of a couple of things in this space. We're talking about social media right now, but the same principles apply. This is not just theory that we're talking about. This is history. This is the big banks being in cahoots with the regulators that are working in government, that are trying to get that J.P. Morgan job, that are trying to eventually get that Citibank, Bank of America executive position, who go lenient on these corporations and watch them expand their power and exude their influence into a point where the bubble bursts and and everything falls apart. These are the same people in the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA that are going easy on places like Purdue Pharma, that are producing these oxycontins that are destroying lives, but not because they mean well. They eventually want the jobs in big pharma. They want the jobs in these corporate industries, and so they're working as one. They're not two separate entities. This is a repetitive process that we keep living through, and in each circumstance, the results have been catastrophic, whether it be the banking collapse of 08, 09, whether it's the opioid epidemic through OxyContin that began. And we're seeing it now again through some of these other less addictive, and I'll use those quotes, less addictive opioids. Right here in Virginia, down in the Southwest, people are still being addicted to, and they're backed by people and they're supported by people in government. So the collusion between government and corporate industry and even the media is making it as if there are two separate Americas. There's a ruling class that controls those things, and then there's everybody else who has to live under their authority, who gets spied on, who loses their rights in a whole host of ways, to include privacy, which is what we started this. To your point, when I get in Washington D.C., we're going to go after some of these interests. We've got to start breaking up the powerful, because they're using their power and their money and their outsized influence in order not to do altruism or altruistic deeds. They're gaining more power and more control, and they're exuding that power over the average American people who are just struggling to survive.
Well, I hope you do. And I will give you just a smidge of advice. Don't go after them, work with them. And I know that sounds maybe, antithetical to the situation, but what I've found from reading in history is that when people accumulate a lot of power, corporations and situations, what happens is the authority and the power ultimately becomes responsibility. And once you accumulate so much of it, you start to realize that maybe I can't handle what I've got. And so I think in a lot of situations, my guess is these corporations look at Twitter, for example, and all the situations they had with like maintaining, speech on their platform, and Jack Dorsey, leaving, and Elon Musk buying. It's like they accumulated so much power and they didn't know what to do with their power. They didn't know how to maintain that responsibility. And so they struggled. I think what it really takes is a thoughtful group of legislatures to understand the business, to listen to people that are in charge of these corporations who understand that, and then to write the legislation to balance that. I think too often our legislatures are uninformed, and they allow the corporations to write too much of the legislation. And I think just becoming educated, working with a group of legislators inside of the Senate, in coercion with the House, to be able to solve this problem. Never go after somebody, because when you power meets power, right? When you create an enemy, that enemy wants to go back at you. But I do appreciate it. Let's move on to the situation in Russia and Ukraine. So
Mm.
many Americans right now, you know, they I don't think a lot of people understand the situation, and there's a lot that goes into it. So just to give a little brief history, so Russia from my study, right? And I could be wrong. If you're listening out there and I've said something incorrect, please correct me, because my expertise is not in Russian history; it's in American history. So, but Russia first took land in what's now Ukraine in 1667 during the Russo-Polish War. Then again in 1686 during the Great Turkish War. The Ukrainian People's Republic was founded in 1917. It was recognized by the Russian provisional government and denounced by the Bolshevik takeover. And they declared their independence in 1918. Now, this was overthrown by pro-German forces, and they lost territory to the Bolsheviks. Just again for our listeners, the Bolsheviks were led by Lenin. They were a far left faction of the Marxist group, and they seized power during the October Revolution in 1917. Fast forward to our lifetime, Russia annexed parts of Ukraine in 2014. They then invaded Ukraine in 2022. We have an ongoing battle right now, and I guess the question becomes, do the Ukrainian people, regardless of their faults, deserve the same independence as the Americans from the revolution? And what is America's role to play in this global conflict?
Are you asking me? I believe in as much freedom around the globe as possible. I don't want a tyrannical government, regardless of who it is, running roughshod over the region. Now, to your point, I'm not a Russian history expert in at all. I believe that the concerns at the beginning of this conflict, so let's go a little bit before 2022, back to late 2021, when this looked like it could become a conflict. And President Zelensky, if you go back to late 2021, was specifically telling the U.S. and the West and Britain to stay out of the negotiations, that they were in charge of the negotiations, and Zelensky, it was my understanding, was working with President Putin, and they were going to come to the table and figure out whatever disagreements that they had based on this history and how each side saw it. Fast forward a couple months. Joe Biden meets with Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson makes his way over to Ukraine and tells Zelensky, stop negotiating. We got your back. They're not going to, don't give them an inch. And I think it was February of 2022. Now we're at war, or they're at war. Since then, and I would also now go back a little bit further on my own history. So I spent about 8 years in the Special Operations community under Special Operations Europe, Special Operations Command Europe in Stuttgart, Germany. That organization specifically exists. There's a Special Forces group, there's a Navy SEAL team, there's a whole Special Operations community that is specifically designed to deter and act towards any Russian aggression. That's why our European forces exist. So what we knew, and we have known for quite some time, that the Russian military could never do the things that they threatened to do. They just didn't have the power. They didn't have the military industrial complex. They didn't have the trained soldiers and leaders within their defense forces. We knew that, but we were okay with that. So they would threaten, and we would go to the negotiating table. We would work something out, and then they would get pushed back. They tried to invade Georgia back when George Bush was our president. We stepped forward. We said he'd get out of there. A couple weeks later, they got out of Georgia. That was the relationship. That's the relationship that's been around since the end of the Cold War. We knew, the military knows that. The military's been knowing that. So when Russia, at the beginning of this war, they couldn't necessarily fight it. They didn't have trained commanders. They didn't have a military-industrial complex. The equipment that they did have was old, pre-Soviet Union days, and their military-industrial complex didn't exist within their borders. That is where we would want them. We want them in that position. Because we refused or we encouraged Zelensky not to negotiate with them, we've entered into an armed conflict. So the first 6-8 months, if you go back to 2022, remember, Russia couldn't advance. They were stuck in the mud. Their convoys were getting hit. All of those scenarios that I just talked about were playing out right in front of our eyes. But now it's a protracted engagement. We've seen over the last 2 years that the Russian military commanders now have 2 years of wartime experience on their hands. They have a military industrial complex within their borders that is producing ammunition and tanks and equipment for their troops. We're seeing their coffers being filled because the same thing that we did do during that was sanction them. And so that sanction led to a rise of oil prices across the globe for us, for the West, who are no longer buying fossil fuels from Russia. However, Russia is still using that high price to sell to China and India and around the world. So they're making more money off of this thing. If the goal was ever to to degrade Russia, we've done the exact opposite. We've filled their coffers. We've put them in a stronger position. We've increased their military capacity and supply, and we've given their commanders 2 years of wartime experience. That's not what we should have been doing from the very beginning. I said it from the beginning that there is no military solution that we would want that's going to come out of this armed conflict. 2 years later, they've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens. There's a massive atrocity taking place, and I just don't see a way out of it that involves Ukraine not being controlled by Russia. And it's that's just looking forward from a military perspective. We gotta do what we have to do to end the death, and hopefully we can come to a resolution that does just that. What it looks like, I don't know because I'm not in those negotiations. What I do know is that we have a senator here in Virginia that sits on the Foreign Relations Committee that should have known this. He also sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, so he gets those briefs. He should have known this, and he hadn't spoken out a word to prevent any of these problems that we see. That's one of the many reasons I think I'm best suited to fill those positions once we defeat him in November.
So you you touched on a very interesting point. I think that kind of repeats itself in history. Is typically conflicts are sped up by bad decisions, right? And so what it sounds like you're saying is originally we were in a good position, but the decisions that we made since then have put us in a worse position. And I believe you said that as we sit now, there's really no feasible way that Ukraine can survive without Russia taking over. Is that what you said?
Not without troops on the ground, not without direct involvement from the West and NATO, which means America. We can guise it in the language of NATO if we want to, but at the end of the day, 90% of any work, any money, any bullets, any people are going to be American. And so, unless the American people are going to get involved to stop Russia's aggression there in Ukraine, which I'm not in favor of, I just don't see how it works from a military perspective. And that's a sad state of affairs.
So when you get to the Senate and you're tasked with voting on bills for arming Ukraine or supporting maybe a NATO, troops on the ground or something like that, what would you propose that's different? Maybe you don't agree with those things, and that's fine. But what would you propose for the American people? What do you think is in the best interest of the citizens of Virginia?
That we stop funding this boondoggle of a war that is unwinnable, and we know it's unwinnable. That's just the frankness of it. It's not a winnable position for Ukraine. It's not a winnable position for the West. There's no political will from politicians nor of the citizens that want to see Americans continue to fight another war overseas that has no end to it. At the same time, we have an emboldened China on the opposite side of the earth, that the same military-industrial complex, the same war hawks are going to say that we have to send troops there too. There's not to mention there's conflict in the Middle East. We're bombing 3 different countries right now in the Middle East. All of these things have come to pass because of poor decisions. We have to stop throwing bad money after good, and that sunk cost fallacy of the logical arguments, and say, okay, what is the best path forward? The best path forward is to stop spending our blood and treasure around the globe, especially on places that are unwinnable or have minimal impact on the American citizens' lives, and then start to refocus it to where it should be, which is prioritizing Americans, and in my case, prioritizing Virginians.
So, what would you say to Americans who are supportive of the war, or supportive of Ukraine, that want to protect Ukraine as kind of like a wall against Russian expansion. Now, as I mentioned, Russia as a nation has always been an aggressor. It's always instigating itself into others' lands. It's not always won. There was the Japan Russo War in the early 1900s where they lost a lot of land, but they've gained it back. You know what can America do to protect its interest? If it's not supporting Ukraine, is there something else that we can do? Is there somewhere else we can invest our time and our resources into to make sure that if Russia does expand, they don't ever expand to a point where it threatens our safety?
Well, I think that, and again, I'm no Russian apologist. I'm just a military guy that's kind of looked at this thing from the lens in which I've looked at it as a service member and a leader. And the way I remember part of the history that you didn't lay out was the agreements that George Bush made after the Berlin Wall fell and the expansion of NATO itself and how we wouldn't move 1 inch to the east. We didn't uphold that. And now you can argue we shouldn't have upheld it. But nonetheless, agreements were made, decisions were made. And it seems, if you listen to what Putin actually says, in his diatribe on the history of NATO and its expansion, is that he's protecting his citizens from a Western aggression. Again, it just kind of depends on how you look at that.
Mm.
If we're talking about what do we do now to make sure Russia doesn't expand further, well, we need to be a stronger nation. We need to be a nation that people do, and Russia itself and China and any other bad actors do fear. And we can't be strong internationally unless we're strong domestically. And right now we're weak domestically because we fight over things that, quite frankly, don't matter to the majority of people. We have currently a weakened economy. We have a labor participation rate that's a mess. We have a humanitarian crisis at our own border. We have public schools and school boards that you're familiar with where regular people are screaming at each other on cultural issues that involve our children that it should never have been there. We have a corrupt political class, to include Foreign Relations Chairman Bob Menendez, who's being bribed allegedly by Egyptians with gold bars in his basement. We have Congressman Henry Cuellar, who's under investigation right now for taking bribes, also allegedly,
Don't forget
that
about the
as
Republican.
reported. So
Don't
all
forget
of
about the
these things.
Republicans, the George Santoses of the world as well, right? This is a
Sure.
bipartisan issue.
Oh, absolutely. No, this is a one way street, and it involves the people in power in Washington D.C., regardless of what they call themselves: Democrats, Libertarians, Independents, Socialists, Democratic Socialists. It's the people in power and the people in charge that are continuing dividing this nation. This nation is weak, and because this nation is weak, the rest of the world is emboldened. That's how we've gotten here. We're $35 trillion in debt. How are we going to pay for another war? We can't retain troops. We can't recruit troops to meet the levels that we require. We can't build enough ships to meet the level in which we need right now to combat China. We're short in so many places. We've taken so much of our stockpiles within the military and given it to Ukraine that we haven't backfilled our own stockpiles. So America continues to get weaker, and the rest of the world seems emboldened. The only way to reverse that is to make America stronger. The only way to do that is to start focusing on the people that it governs, its citizens, and start spending its investment and its time focusing on how do we build the jobs and the economy and the community that we need back in this country, so that we can be a united government, a united Washington D.C., not a divided people. And right now we're just a divided people. And so the idea that we're going to come together when we hate each other to go fight somebody else in a unified fashion, that's just not realistic. And which is why it's not happening, and why there's a lot of chaos globally. We can't be strong. I'll
So
say it over and over again. We cannot be strong internationally if we're not strong domestically. And we're not strong domestically because we have Washington, D.C., that's getting paid by people and campaign contributions by people who are invested overseas, not here at home.
I'll push back a little bit. You said that we were weak. I disagree with that statement. I think that while we appear to be weak, or maybe we are weaker than we have been in other spots, we are still an incredibly strong nation. Our the geography of our nation, with oceans on either side of us, makes us strong. The massive population that we have makes us strong. The incredibly educated population that we have makes us strong. The Second Amendment, where every American has the ability to buy a firearm and use a firearm, means that we have more trained individuals with weapons than any other country on the world, and that all makes us strong. And you hit on something else. You mentioned the Navy, and this is an area where in my reading it keeps on coming up. It started with John Adams. He really wanted to invest in the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to invest in the Navy. FDR wanted to invest in the Navy and did invest in the Navy. And you could make the argument that it was the Roosevelts' investment in the Navy that really helped us secure power and keep ourselves safe during World War II. And specifically, we're in Virginia. And I believe there's a military or a naval base somewhere in Virginia. Is there not?
Yeah, there definitely is.
And so, maybe it would be in the best interest of America and Virginia if we invested a little bit of that money into building up the Navy, as you mentioned, making sure, because if we, a lot of times wars are won and lost by controlling, shipping line, or, commerce lines, shipping lanes, and stuff like that. And so, if we're able to have a strong military, a strong Navy, I think that makes us a stronger nation. So I appreciate that insight, and I appreciate you've got a lot of experience in the military world that I don't have. So I do appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, when I say maybe I wasn't too clear. I could have been more precise on the being strong domestically. Yeah, due to our geographical regions, and to your point, the Second Amendment, the U.S. isn't at risk of being invaded by a foreign power. Um, Now you could argue that what's going on our southern border, we don't know who's coming in, and so that's a different subject. But what I'm talking about is our political strength, the being unified into the ideas and the issues that we should agree on, we can't agree on because we're already divided amongst all these other things that are, I'm going to say, they're less important, but they don't have such as a grand effect as some of these geopolitical international military engagements right now. And if we're supposed to have a government that needs to be united and voted and should be voting on whether or not to engage another country militarily or send troops or money militarily, and we can't get that passed because our politics are too divided, well, then that's what I mean by weak, not necessarily the we're at risk of being invaded on our sovereign land here.
Yeah. All right. So you just mentioned the next topic, which is the southern border, immigration. So through my history, my reading of history, America has, for the most part, been a pro-immigration country, right? We were immigrants that moved here, and then so the first legislation that kind of started this was the Passenger Act of 1819, which basically secured safe passage for immigrants from Europe to the United States. As the nation has grown and more people have come to America, legislation has been written to, I wouldn't say restrict, but limit and refine those who come to America. And so, like, we've got some of it was, racial in nature, and some of it is just practical in nature. You've got the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, you've got the Immigration Act of 1891, and it continues on over and over again, where we set rules and regulations and then we write new rules and regulations. And I think, the last, the big Immigration Act back in the Reagan administration was 1986, I believe. And since then, I don't know if we've really written anything substantial. I mean, there's a few, but nothing real. And now we're kind of faced with this problem where I don't think anybody really, I don't think there's any rules. We've got sanctuary cities, we've got, one group of people saying build a wall and keep them out, and another group of people saying tear down the wall and let everybody in, and nobody's really talking about what do we they're people, like they want to be here. Why don't we create a process that allows the good people to be here, and
It keeps out the bad. Yeah.
screens everybody so we can keep the bad people out. I mean, as you know, I'm not a big Trump fan, and during his first thing that he talked about building the wall, he made that famous line where he said, they're not sending their best people, they're sending their rape, and everybody took that as a racial dig on the Mexican people. But in reality, as inarticulate as he was, he's not necessarily wrong. We are allowing anyone to come in the nation, and we're not doing anything to protect ourselves. We're not doing anything to protect American citizens. So what does Senator Eddie Garcia, what does he want to do when he gets to the Senate? What is he going to propose to solve or mediate this problem?
Yeah, this is a multifaceted issue, and sadly, it's always boiled down to sound bites. And so, first and foremost, I was born in South Texas. I'm a son of South Texas. I've looked at that border being as porous as it is my entire lifetime, right? And to your point, there's nothing been done since 1986. Ronald Reagan, the great conservative himself, Ronald Reagan gave a bunch of people amnesty and promise of border security. The amnesty came, and the border security never happened. That's just where we reside these days. Separate to that, we also have asylum laws, and so the asylum laws that are currently on the books. These are laws passed by legislators in Congress that are the rule of the law, and the rule of the law say that if you show up at a port of entry and you claim asylum, if you read the script that they give you and you say that I'm being persecuted for political reasons, wherever it is that you come from, that you can seek asylum here in America. That is a rule, a law that's being used against us right now by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And so the executive branch, because the legislative branch refuses to change it or have the votes, or for whatever reason hasn't taken this up, the executive branch has essentially two options. They can detain someone until their asylum laws or their asylum claim is adjudicated, or they can parole that person. And so during the Trump administration, if you remember the beginning part of that, he's like, we're going to detain all these people. And they're going to come in, and they built detainment centers. They put cages up, and some of them were left from the Obama administration. And that became a big to-do about who built the cages. At the end of the day, they were detaining people here in America. And the Trump administration got a lot of pushback, and they said, you know what, then the executive order said we're going to make them remain in Mexico. So yeah, we're still going to detain them, but you can't wait here until your asylum claim is adjudicated. That's where remain in Mexico came into place. And then because it's an executive order, when President Biden comes in, he's able to rescind that order, and he's able to say, okay, everybody who comes across claims asylum, we're going to grant them parole, and we're going to give them a date. And that date has been backlogged for so long, it's 5-6 years away from now. And there we go. And we have a whole bunch of people that are in limbo status that are here that we have no recollection or no idea of who they are, where they've come from, or their political associations, etc. And they come from all around the world. They're not coming necessarily from Mexico. They're coming from Iran. They're coming from Haiti. They're coming from China. They're coming from all across the globe. They're flying in to Venezuela, which is a socialist country who's anti-American, and they're making that journey up through Central America, through Mexico, and onto our southern border. That's just where we're at. So what we have to do first and foremost is we have to have a border wall that honestly President Trump asked for 7 years ago. It was 7 years ago. Congress said that it was going to cost $29 billion and that it was too much money. We couldn't afford it. Now we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars ever since. And the problem is worse than ever. And we've gotten nowhere. And so we have to secure this border. So to your point, we understand who the heck is coming in our country. And if they're a threat, if they're associated with the CCP, if they're associated with the IRGC, if they're associated with some other entity that we don't appreciate and we don't want in our country, we can identify them, we can screen them, we can keep them out. Separate to that, people who do have skills that we need to be able to process them through easy so that they can come in and they can get to work and they can put into our system. We have a lot of issues right now because we have an economy that's short workers. We're short workers, just day workers. We're short workers in the ag industry, the typical immigrant, migrant way to live and work. But we're also short medical practitioners. We're short doctors. We got 1,000 counties across America that don't have a primary care manager. We're short tradesmen, people with skills in electrical and plumbing and HVAC and things like that. We can start to prioritize these people, but first we have to stop the flow of all the other people that don't qualify for those things. And then we start to rank them. Who speaks English at a certain level, because they get first dibs, because they can show up and get to work right away. They can be putting in, paying taxes, paying into Social Security, helping people who are on Social Security maintain their lifestyle. We can do these things. We can help small businesses that can't get the higher ease that they have here in America because the skills don't exist, because our education system has failed. We can't do any of that until we secure the border. Our immigration policy should be pretty simple. Just like you said, be able to keep out the people that we don't want, be able to make it easy to bring in the people that we do want, so that we know and they're the right way. I think the vast majority, 90% of Americans agree with that. People that have come here legally, the right way, that have waited in line, have paid their dues. My wife, I went through the immigration system as a military guy with a foreign-born wife. My wife was born in Latin America. It took us about 8 years to make her a citizen. We had to, multiple times back to the consulate and the embassy, multiple submissions, thousands of dollars, lots of time and confusion and heartache. And I'm an American. I speak the language. It's still not easy to get through that system. We have to redo that system, but we can't even start that process because we got hundreds of thousands that are overflowing our border every single month. Until we fix that, we can't fix anything. And that's just where we're at. So in my
Yeah.
opinion, first things first, we got to start to secure the border. We got to start funneling people to ports of entry. We got to start increasing dramatically these asylum claims processes, so that we can find out the people that are here, do they have a legit asylum claim or do they not? And if they don't, which is the vast majority of them, they got to go back to where they are at, and reapply the right way. Those who do and have a legit asylum claim, well, then they're granted asylum status like any other asylum seeker throughout the history of this country. And then we have to start fixing our immigration system for the people who want to show up and work for the companies that actually want to grow their business here in America. And that's where we should be focused. Growing businesses here in America, keeping those businesses here in America with people who are paying into the American system and American taxes, not outsourcing and offshoring. It's time to start doing things different. We got to reshore our supply chains by putting people to work right here in Virginia.
So I agree with so much what you said. I don't think people understand that, a competent immigration system helps our economy. It helps fill those jobs that we need. It helps pay into Social Security, with having people pay taxes that otherwise wouldn't pay taxes. Now, I'll push back just a smidge on your order of things, right? You say secure the border and then write legislation. I think that it has to be done in tandem. I think if you're going to be successful at securing the border, Republicans have to come to the table with like thoughtful immigration policy. And I think that's been a problem is, one side wants everybody in and one side seems to want nobody in, and nobody, I mean, there has been some, compromise here and there. There was the Gang of Eight with Rubio and McCain back in the day, but they never really got anything done. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure why they can't get anything done. It doesn't make sense other than the fact that it is they are decentivized, or they're not incentivized to solve the problem because it is an election issue and it rallies
Absolutely.
people to the voting booth. But at the end of the day, I think we've gotten to a point where, if we want to continue to have the freedom to elect our own officials and whatnot, we have to understand that we actually have to elect officials that do their job and write legislation and solve problems. I know that some people might push back and say, well, it's they kind of go for the racial angle and say that it's not fair, they should be allowed in here. And it goes back to my point about like, is American freedom guaranteed to all citizens of the world? Like, are we supposed to be able to do that as a country? And I think about it as a family, right? Like, I have 5 kids. If I see, there's plenty of times that I hear about kids in tough situations, and I always like will go to my wife and be like, we should adopt a kid. Like we should adopt one. But after we think about it, we go, we can't take care of them. We don't have any rooms free in the house. I don't have extra income to feed another child. I can't, it's not responsible of me to take in more people to my family. And I think that's where we're sitting with America, right? Like we just keep on taking people in with no actual way to allow them to take care of themselves. You know, it's not even that we have to take care of them. We just have to provide them rules to do it on their own. They're perfectly capable of doing it. We're just not doing our job at the end of the day. So um,
The
I would love to
laziest
see.
I was going to say the laziest of arguments is to make it a racial argument, because it dismisses the real concerns. The great thing about America, and I think Reagan, you mentioned Reagan earlier. I think he said it once that you can go to Germany, but you'll never be German. You can go to China, but you'll never be Chinese. But you can come to America and you can become an American. We allowed that. That's our culture. That's our history. That's what we want. But to what's going on right now is that we have so many people living on very small incomes. We have so many schools that are overcrowded. We have so many problems with the needy here in America, and we have resources. We together collectively we have agreed that there are a portion of the population that we should be trying our best to take care of. Those people, those vulnerable populations, low income, working class, Hispanics or Asians or people that have come from all backgrounds that are currently here the right way, that are trying to make their way, they're living in not the best circumstances. Their resources are being drained, are being taken up by people who are just barnstorming our southern border, and people are not happy about it. It's not a racial thing. They're not racist for being angry about that. It's their communities. And I say this all the time as a Hispanic. Right here in Virginia, there's 11% of the population, 803,000, 33% in Prince William County is Hispanic. Nobody understands the negative aspects of that border more than the working class Hispanics, because it's our neighborhoods that the fentanyl traverses in. It's our kids that are dying off of it. It's our neighbors. It's the door next door that these criminals, these human traffickers are coming across. They're living next to us in our neighborhoods. It's our kids' public school system that's being overcrowded with these unaccompanied minors. We take the brunt of that. This is the population that takes the brunt of that. But nobody on TV actually wants to bring it up in that light, because it's the biggest. And I made the money sign because it's the biggest money maker for politicians and these fundraisers in the political class. Nothing generates money here in Washington, D.C. more than a caravan of migrants walking themselves up through Mexico heading to our border, because the media and the right wing media generate all the publicity and get people outraged, and they get them donating and clicking that box for their politician or their fundraiser, and they make a ton of money doing it. And when they do that, the Democrats do the same, and they say, look how much money that President Trump or these right wingers are raising. You have to send us money so that we can combat it. And they raise a bunch of money, they pocket a bunch of money. We get upset at one another. Nothing happens. 6 months later, another caravan starts to form, and we relive it and we relive it. This is what
Yeah.
aggravating about the whole system. This is why it's important that we have people, candidates like I say myself, people that come from us. Because if we don't, we got a government and a political class that come at us, and they come at us in this way by dividing us, reaping their rewards off of our backs and enriching themselves, and we get poor and more angry. It's time to stop it. It's time for a better tomorrow.
Yeah, I agree. So we're running low on time, so I'm gonna just get one more topic in before we got to go today. So we've talked about the economy a few times now. The if the inflation, I think, is what American families are feeling right now. It cost. I have 5 children. I struggle to feed my family and to pay that grocery bill. It feels like a bag of chips, right? Not that you should be buying a lot of bag of chips, right? But a bag of chips is like, it used to be like $2.50, and now it's like $7. A box of cereal, a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs. Like we're seeing massive inflation across the board. The Fed targets an inflation rate of 2%, and during the 80s, the early 80s, inflation rates were as high as 14.93%. And that caused the Fed to take some dramatic action. Now, fast forward to the Biden administration. Since Biden took office, rates have hit as high as 9.1%. I would like to, just, somebody might hear that question and think, well, this is all Biden's problem. I just want to clarify that Carter was the administration before Reagan, and the inflation rate hit high with Reagan as president. And Trump was the administration before Biden, and the inflation rate hit high when Biden was in office. So I think this is a bipartisan issue. I don't think that neither Biden or Trump should take blame on this. I think this is bad management of our country in a lot of ways. I think they both did things that spiked this. But if we fast forward, we just say, okay, this is where we're at. The economy is kind of chugging along, but very slowly. The inflation rate has spiked, and it seems like it's kind of coming down, maybe stabilizing, but we're not really sure. It could spike again. What can Congress do to help the economy? And most importantly, should Congress do anything to help the economy?
Well, the biggest parts of this inflation are food and energy. Food and energy. That's where people feel it the most when they're putting in tanks of gas at the gas station, whether their electric bill in the house, or they're trying to buy something to eat for their family and they're going grocery shopping. The biggest driver of those two things, and inflation of food and energy over the last 2.5 years, has been the war in Ukraine. We'll circle back around to that. I mean, the sanctioning of Russia drove up the cost of energy dramatically. That's why we feel a lot of that pinch. And also, Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, and so there's a lot of food shortages that have come out because of the war and driven up the price. Separate to that, there's also a war on farmers. That war on farmers comes directly from the left, quite frankly. Here in Virginia, we've lost about 10% of our small farms, mostly south of Richmond and into the southwest a bit, because we have a government right now. And it kind of dovetails back to the collusion we talked about between industry and government. We have a federal government that is squeezing our farmers and our ranchers through regulations, trying to reduce their profit margins. And then at the same time, we have friends of the government in corporate America that are trying to buy up that land from them at a cheap discount. Stop putting up with the government, Mr. Farmer. Just sell to the big corporation and we'll take care of it all. We'll give you a good payday. When they do that, that corporation goes right back to the government and says, hey, I'm going to put green energy and solar panels all over this thing. Can you give me all these subsidies that you promised? And then they get billions of dollars in subsidies, and they get rid of our farmland. They destroy it, and they put these solar panels all over Southside right now. That's an issue that is going on right now, right in Virginia. Meanwhile, the supply of food continues to shrink, driving up the costs at the grocery store. This is the worst of all scenarios. And prices are not going to come down unless we stop these things and start to reverse it. We need to increase food supply. We need to make it easier for farmers and ranchers to turn a profit. If a government should be doing anything, one of the things that it should be doing is protecting its citizens and helping the industry feed their citizens. Because if we can't fight our wars and defend ourselves, and we can't grow our food and feed ourselves, we can't survive. That is a fundamental difference between me and anybody else running in this race, and a lot of the majority of the Republicans, because I believe that the government does have a role in 2024 to help farmers succeed so they can feed the people that we have in this country. I believe that. And I always say that because we're going to have a farm bill that was supposed to get done. It hasn't gotten done yet. And we're going to see a bunch of Republicans vote against it. And they're going to vote against it along ideological terms. I would vote for it because I think we need to help our farmers and ranchers turn profit so that they can stay in business and not sell out to these corporations that are going to just turn around and ruin the land. And once you put solar panels on that land, it's done. You're not going to use that land for another 100 years. We just can't continue to go down this road. We have to start solving these problems. And so food, energy, and then the supply chain. We got to start manufacturing. We got to start growing stuff. We got to start putting Americans back to work, because a lot of this inflation started during the COVID time, when our ports shut down and travel was limited, and everything that we make, it seems to be not here in America. It's made in India, it's made in China, it's made in Europe, it's made everywhere else. And so these key items that we needed then, we couldn't get. Prices went up through the roof, and now they've stayed there because nobody ever reduces their prices at the grocery store or anywhere else for that matter. So
So
if we're going to stop this, we need good paying jobs. We got to get jobs enough so that people get paid more, and alleviate some of that stress at the food market and at the gas pump.
So I'll push back just a little bit again. You said Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine thing is a large portion of the inflation. I would argue that it was the COVID stimuluses during the Trump administration, and then what really, really hurt it was Biden continuing those once he get into office, because I don't think that they were needed to be continued, and I think they printed too much money. The bubble burst in a way, and now we're kind of left holding the bag. I love your focus on like the basics, right? I know that there's a group, if you love freedom, you want free trade and stuff like that to compete in the global market. I can respect that, but there comes a, in if you when you talk about like what you just talked about, you might be labeled like a nationalist, right? And nationalism kind of has a bad tinge to it. But what you're really talking about is the basics. You're not talking about nationalism. You're not talking about protecting all American industries. You're talking about protecting the basics for Americans so we can be safe and be fed. And I don't know how many Americans actually recognize how bad our farming situation is. Where we are, I'm in Nokesville, right down the road from me. There's Chinese companies that owns massive amounts of land, right? And you mentioned, small time farmers are having to sell out to large corporate farms, and then they're, converting it to other things, and we're losing farmland, that we're losing the ability to feed ourselves. Um, and back to the Ukraine issue, why does Russia want to invade Ukraine? Why have they been aggressive going into the Ukrainian era all the way back to the 1600s? Well, you kind of hit on it, because it's the breadbasket of the world. And how are wars won and lost? Through the basics, through maintaining breaking up shipping lines, transportation lines, communication lines, and then controlling basic resources like ammunition and food, right? The military industrial complex in America controls the ammunition that we need to win a war. But, the rest of the world controls the food in a lot of ways. And we have a large and prosperous nation that we should be able to maintain both. And I think that the government should focus on making sure that American citizens can protect their food, and making sure that we can, feed ourselves. And I don't, kind of get a little away from the inflation question, didn't I? I apologize. But, it, if what I tell my kids all the time is like, focus on the basics. If you focus on the basics, everything else will kind of like level itself out. And so, how do we solve our economy? How do we fix the inflation rate? Bringing things back home, putting people to work. That way, they're paying into the tax system. We're able to like actually do things that we need to do. What is there anything particularly legislatively that you could do as a senator, or you would want to do to protect this type of situation?
Well, yeah, we got to start reducing regulations that the EPA is implementing and the FDA is implementing on these small farmers. Again, these are regulators, in my opinion, and I think that's kind of been shown out throughout time, is that these regulators are just buying time so they can get an executive position in one of the big ag industries, so that they can profit off of it. That's and now that it hit my head, my thought, that is one of the biggest problems that we have is it's becoming, our government is becoming a grifter government. It is a government by me for me, rather than a government for us. And the people that are in charge are only thinking about their next thing, and their next thing involves them. If you're a 1, 2, 3, 4 star in the Pentagon right now, and you're looking at retirement, you're already looking at that the defense industry executive position, that six-figure job where where you got a title and you get a chance to sit in a nice office. When you're in one of these regulatory bodies or agencies that's regulating banks, you're just trying to get into being one of those banks and going to those conferences and making that money and being somebody. We have to service needs to be about service. We need people who want to serve and not be served. I read that somewhere. That's a joke, by the way. But and so we have to start focusing on that. And to your point about the inflation and the amount of money that's given out and the amount of money that's printed, I agree with you. I agree. We spend too much money. We print too much money. My biggest issue in that scenario, in this conversation, is that, let's just say there's a tragedy that's plagued our nation, and the government says, "Hey, we're going to give out $100 billion." Who do you give that $100 billion? Do you give it to individuals and single moms that you've put out of work and that you've taken out of a job, who have kids now that they need to send to daycare or whatever? Or do you give it to the airline industry and they fire all their staff and they force retire their pilots, and then look at you a year later and going, "Hey, we need more money because we don't have enough pilots"? I mean, that is the corruption of the system. These Democrats talk about billionaires and their tax breaks and their loopholes. I agree with that. We need to eliminate those tax breaks and eliminate those tax loopholes. At the same time, we have Ivy League universities that are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars in tax-free endowments nobody talks about. This is the hypocrisy of the whole thing, is that if we're going to spend money, and I'm not in favor of spending it, but if we're going to print money, who do we send that to? Do we send it to Ukraine? Do we give it to Silicon Valley Bank over a weekend because they made poor decisions? Or do we help farmers and ranchers? Do we help grow our food? Do we help single moms? Do we help veterans get off the street and get the health care that they need? The priorities are so misaligned. We can't continue this. So I always say we have to reprioritize. We got to reprioritize our government. It should be focused on the people. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it nationalism, but I don't know how people are going to classify that. I just think it is as common sense. If we have a government by,
Yeah.
with, for the people, we should be focused on the people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's back to my analogy with, other kids in my family, right? Like, you can only do what you can do. And we really, the think about the airplane analogy, right? Like, what you put the mask on yourself first, and then you help your child. And the reason you do that is so you are protected. Because if you put it on your kid first and then you pass out in the process, your kid ain't going to be able to help you, right? And so, we're not taking care of the basics in this country. We're not taking care of ourselves. And I feel like it's just a bunch of name calling. Like, if you want to have serious debates on how to solve these problems, they lump you into a group and they label you with something, and then all of a sudden, like, you're now a socialist, or you're now a nationalist, or you're a communist, or you're a MAGA, or you're a progressive. And it's like, you know as you know, I'm a big Madison guy, right? And the whole concept of our government is to allow all of those groups to come together and then talk to each other. And, overall, we just don't do that anymore. And we don't focus on the right things. We don't have debates. We just yell and name call. And it has resulted in some tough times for Americans, and specifically American families. So um, that's our time today, Eddie. I appreciate you joining the show. Would you like to share a little bit about voting times and locations, or at least like the voting day with the public before we get out of here?
I almost forgot I was running the campaign. Absolutely. So your followers can follow me at eddiegarciava.com. You can follow me at Eddie Garcia VA on all the social media platforms. Virginia is in the midst of a primary voting season right now. So if you show up to your local registrar's office between now and June 15th, you can early vote, and I encourage you to early vote. Many of the congressional districts around the Commonwealth only have one race, and that's this U.S. Senate race. If you ask for a Republican ballot, they'll give it to you. I'm the second name from the top. They can bubble it in, slide it in the machine. The light will go from red to green, and then you cast your vote for Eddie Garcia. And then the next day you bring somebody everybody else to do the same. If we do that, we can win. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a full-throated effort from working men and women across 11 congressional districts voting for Eddie Garcia. And then when we do, we're going to take on Tim Kaine in November. So it's early voting up until June 15th. June 18th is the Tuesday. That is election day. If you, for whatever reason, can't make it in the first 35 days that we have left of early voting, please show up on June 18th and cast your ballot for Eddie Garcia.
Awesome, Eddie. I really appreciate you joining the show. I just got to say, I think this was a great interview. I really appreciate you. I took my time to try to give you some really, difficult questions, and I appreciate the courage to sit in and take them and answer them. I don't think that a lot of the competitors running for office nowadays are willing to actually do that. So good on you, and I wish you the best of luck, man.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Always glad to be here.
All right. Peace and love.